On March 12, 2026, the United States Trade Representative Jamieson Greer walked up to a microphone and said 16 words that will reverberate through global trade corridors for the next decade. He said, "These investigations will focus on economies that exhibit structural excess capacity across manufacturing sectors. 16 trading partners, targeted simultaneously, under a law that hasn't been weaponized at this scale since the Cold War era: India, China, the European Union, Japan, Vietnam, South Korea." And here is your data shock for today. India ran a $58.2 billion goods trade surplus with the United States in 2024. That number by itself is not alarming. But China, $295.5 billion in 2025 alone. The gap between those two numbers tells you everything about why this moment is a structural inflection point, not just for global trade, but for India's irreversible ascent as the world's next dominant economic superpower. Stay with me. Because what we are witnessing today is not just a tariff probe. This is the redrawing of the global economic map. Let's begin with the architecture, because to understand the 301 pivot, you have to understand the weapon being used. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 is, in the simplest terms, America's most powerful unilateral trade enforcement tool. It empowers the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, to investigate foreign governments for unfair trade practices, and then impose retaliatory tariffs, quotas, sanctions on goods. It doesn't require WTO approval. It doesn't require congressional debate. It requires one determination: is this country engaging in practices that are unjustifiable, unreasonable, or discriminatory? And do those practices burden U.S. commerce? If the answer is yes, the tariffs come. Now, here is the critical historical context that most mainstream analysts are completely missing. Section 301 was last deployed at scale by the first Trump administration, specifically against China in 2018 and 2019. Those tariffs eventually escalated to over $370 billion worth of Chinese goods being taxed at rates between 7.5% and 25%. And then, the Biden administration didn't remove them. In fact, Biden expanded them in certain sectors: semiconductors, electric vehicles, solar panels. What that tells you, strategically, is that bipartisan Washington has concluded that the era of free, frictionless globalization, the era where China became the world's factory floor, is structurally over. The question was never if the U.S. would confront its trading partners again. The question was always when, and with what legal architecture. And now we have the answer. Section 301, 16 nations, summer 2026 deadline. Now, why is this happening in March of 2026 specifically? This is the part most YouTube channels haven't explained accurately. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court struck down Trump's global tariffs as illegal. The court ruled that using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the IEEPA, as justification for broad global tariffs exceeded executive authority. In other words, the legal instrument Trump had been using to impose sweeping tariffs on virtually every country on Earth. The highest court in the land said, no, that's unconstitutional. Now, here is where strategic thinking diverges from mainstream reaction. Most analysts said, great, the tariffs are dead, global trade breathes again. Strategic thinkers said something very different. They said, watch what Trump does in the 48 hours after that ruling. And what did he do? He immediately imposed a 10% tariff for 150 days under Section 122 of the Trade Act, a different legal mechanism, while simultaneously directing the USTR to launch Section 301 investigations into 16 trading partners. The threat didn't die, it metamorphosed. This is the definition of institutional adaptability, or in Trump's case, what critics call institutional aggression. The probes are designed to conclude with proposed remedies, meaning new tariffs, before those Section 122 temporary tariffs expire in July of 2026. The message to every trading partner on that list of 16: you have approximately 90 days to renegotiate or face a legally unassailable tariff structure that the Supreme Court cannot touch. That is not trade policy. That is economic coercion with legal architecture. Before we go deeper, if you are watching this channel, you are not here for surface-level headlines. You are here because you understand that the decisions being made in Washington and New Delhi right now will determine where global capital flows for the next 20 years. If you value data-driven, structurally sound analysis over mainstream narratives and partisan noise, subscribe to this channel right now. Join a community of strategic thinkers, macro investors, policy analysts, and global entrepreneurs who are positioning themselves ahead of the shift. not reacting to it after it's already happened. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, because what I'm about to show you in the next 15 minutes, the mainstream media hasn't connected these dots yet. Let's continue. Now let's look at the actual data. The USTR has identified 16 trading partners for this excess capacity probe, and the selection criteria is clear: countries that run large, persistent trade surpluses with the United States, indicating, in Washington's view, structural economic advantages that may be artificially maintained. Let me walk you through the strategic hierarchy. The European Union sits at the top with a $235.9 billion surplus in 2025, up from $218.8 billion in 2024. China follows with a staggering $295.5 billion surplus in 2025, up sharply from $202 billion the year prior. Note that China's surplus grew by $93 billion in a single year, even as tariffs were already in place. That is not a trend. That is a structural defiance of economic pressure. Mexico is third at $171.5 billion. But notably, the surplus is actually shrinking, down from $196.9 billion in 2024. That suggests that the existing tariff pressure on Mexico is beginning to work. Then we have the Asian manufacturing complex. Vietnam, $123.5 billion surplus. Taiwan, $73.7 billion. Thailand, $45.5 billion. Japan, $69.4 billion. South Korea, $66 billion. Malaysia, $24.9 billion. Indonesia, $17.9 billion. Cambodia, $12.3 billion. These are the nations that built their manufacturing export economies by absorbing production that left China after the first round of Trump tariffs. Washington has now figured out that tariffing China while leaving the broader Asian manufacturing web untouched is strategically incomplete. You plug one hole, water finds another. India sits at $45.8 billion surplus in 2025, down from $58.2 billion in 2024. Now, here's the critical strategic question. Why is India's declining surplus still drawing a Section 301 probe? This is where the analysis gets sophisticated. To understand why India's inclusion on this list is strategically different from everyone else's, we have to look at the data they missed. Because India being on this list is not the same as China being on this list. Not even close. And the difference tells you exactly where the next phase of global economic power is being forged. Let's be precise. India's $45.8 billion surplus with the United States in 2025 is real. Pharmaceuticals, IT services, textiles, engineering goods, gems, and jewelry. These are the primary export drivers. But here is what the raw surplus number does not capture. India is simultaneously one of America's fastest growing export markets. U.S. exports to India have been growing at roughly 8 to 12% annually over the past 5 years. Apple is building iPhones in Tamil Nadu. Boeing sources aerospace components from Indian manufacturers. Foxconn, Tata Electronics, Pegatron all have expanded Indian operations specifically to serve the American consumer market while reducing China dependency. In other words, India is not just selling to America. India is becoming structurally embedded in American supply chains. Now ask yourself, is the Trump administration's strategic interest served by imposing punitive Section 301 tariffs on the country that is actively absorbing manufacturing out of China? The answer, if Washington thinks strategically, is no. This is the strategic autonomy paradox at the heart of the 301 pivot. India is on the list, but India's strategic leverage is unlike any other nation on that list. USTR Greer himself acknowledged that trading partners who have stuck to their deals may have a degree of protection. This is diplomatic signaling. India has been engaged in ongoing bilateral trade negotiations with the United States since 2023. The Section 301 probe is not necessarily a declaration of economic war against India. It is a negotiating accelerant. Washington is telling New Delhi, conclude the deal, expand U.S. market access, reduce your surplus, or we formalize the tariff structure under a legal framework that gives us maximum leverage. And what does New Delhi hold in response? 3 cards. Card 1. India's rapidly growing domestic market, currently the world's most populous nation, which American companies desperately want deeper access to. Card 2. India's position as the primary alternative to Chinese manufacturing for Western companies seeking China Plus One supply chain diversification. Card 3. Geopolitical alignment. India is a Quad partner, a key pillar of the Indo-Pacific strategy. The U.S. cannot simultaneously contain China and alienate its most important regional counterweight. These are not weak cards. India does not negotiate from a position of desperation. India negotiates from a position of structural indispensability. Now let's turn to the nation that is the true target of the 301 pivot, China. Look at that number again, $295.5 billion surplus in 2025, up from $202 billion the year before. That is a $93.4 billion increase in a single calendar year, while tariffs were already in place. How is that possible? This is the story of structural excess capacity, the core accusation that the USTR's probe is built upon. After the first wave of Trump tariffs in 2018 and 2019, Beijing made a strategic decision. Don't restructure the economy. Double down on manufacturing. The Chinese government poured hundreds of billions of yuan in subsidies into steel, aluminum, solar panels, electric vehicles, semiconductors, and consumer electronics. Production capacity expanded far beyond domestic demand. The result? A massive overhang of manufacturing output that had to go somewhere. Some of it rerouted through Vietnam, Malaysia, Cambodia, what analysts call tariff laundering, Chinese goods assembled or lightly processed in third countries to avoid U.S. tariff designations. Some of it flooded into Europe, Latin America, and Southeast Asian markets at below-market prices, distorting local industries. And some of it continued flowing directly into the United States, because even with tariffs, China's cost structure and production scale gave exporters enough margin to absorb the tax and remain competitive. This is not a temporary imbalance. It is a deliberate strategic choice by Beijing. And now, Washington has reached a defining conclusion. Targeted tariffs alone, applied to individual product categories, are insufficient to address an economy that treats export volume as a matter of national strategic priority. The Section 301 probe represents a systemic response to a systemic challenge. But here is the second-order effect that most analysts are not discussing. China's $93 billion surplus surge came at a cost. The cost was isolation. Europe is now conducting its own anti-dumping investigations on Chinese EVs and solar panels. India has imposed anti-dumping duties on dozens of Chinese product categories. The global south, in which China long cultivated as an alternative market through Belt and Road, is increasingly resentful of Chinese goods flooding their markets and displacing local manufacturers. China's macroeconomic dominance in manufacturing is generating geopolitical backlash on every continent simultaneously. This is not strength. This is the architecture of overextension. This isn't just a trend. This is a permanent shift in the global order. And the country best positioned to capture the capital, the manufacturing contracts, and the geopolitical goodwill that China is systematically surrendering? You already know the answer. Let's look at the structural evidence. The IMF projects India to become the world's third largest economy by 2027, surpassing Japan and Germany. The World Bank identifies India as the fastest growing major economy for the fifth consecutive year. But here is the structural argument, the one that goes beyond headline GDP numbers. Pillar 1. Demographic dividend. India has the world's largest working-age population, while China faces an aging demographic crisis. With a shrinking labor force and rising pension obligations, India will add approximately 8 to 10 million new workers to its labor force every single year through 2045. This is not a short-term advantage. This is a generational structural asset. Pillar 2. Production-linked incentive architecture. The Indian government's PLI, Production-Linked Incentive Scheme, has committed over $26 billion across 14 key sectors: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, electronics, textiles, specialty chemicals, defense manufacturing. These are not aspirational targets. These are activated capital flows with contractual timelines. Apple's India production crossed $14 billion in export value in fiscal year 2025, more than doubling year on year. Pillar 3. Digital infrastructure scale. India's Unified Payments Interface, UPI, processed over 18 billion transactions in a single month in 2025. The India Stack, the layered digital identity, payment, and credit infrastructure, is now being exported to other nations as a sovereign technology product. This is India exporting institutional infrastructure, not just goods. That is the marker of a nation transitioning from emerging market to global economic architect. Pillar 4. Strategic autonomy in geopolitics. India refused to join Western sanctions on Russia after 2022. India simultaneously deepened its Quad partnerships with the United States, Japan, and Australia. India chairs the Global South discourse at the G20. India negotiates bilateral trade deals with the EU, the UK, the UAE, and now accelerates discussions with the United States. This is not fence-sitting. This is masterclass strategic positioning. India does not subordinate its economic interests to any single power's foreign policy agenda. India dictates the terms of its own strategic partnerships. And in a world where Washington is simultaneously fighting trade wars on 16 fronts, a partner that won't be coerced is infinitely more valuable than a vassal that can be pressured. There is a second investigation embedded in this 301 pivot that is receiving far less attention, and it has massive implications for global manufacturing geography. USTR Greer announced on the same day that he would initiate a separate Section 301 probe focused specifically on forced labor in global supply chains. This investigation covers more than 60 countries. The precedent exists. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, signed under Biden, effectively banned imports from China's Xinjiang region, covering solar panels, polysilicon, cotton, and other goods. The new probe seeks to expand that framework globally, building a legal architecture to ban U.S. imports of goods produced with forced labor from any country. Bangladesh, which sits on the 16-nation trade surplus list, is particularly exposed. Bangladesh's garment industry is a $40+ billion export economy, supplying major American and European fashion brands. If the forced labor probe results in import restrictions on Bangladeshi goods, the reshoring of garment and textile production becomes an immediate business imperative for global brands. And where is the most credible alternative? India's textile sector, the second largest employer in the country, is structurally positioned to absorb that demand. The combination of competitive labor costs, improving infrastructure, PLI incentives for technical textiles, and, critically, a labor rights framework that can withstand Western scrutiny gives India a compelling offer. This is what second-order strategic thinking looks like. The forced labor probe is not just about punishing bad actors. It is about rewarding compliant alternatives. And India, if it moves with speed and institutional focus, captures that reward. To understand why the summer of 2026 is the most important inflection point in global trade since the 2018 US-China tariff war, we have to synthesize everything we've just analyzed into a single, coherent strategic forecast. Because right now, right at this moment, the decisions being made by trade negotiators in New Delhi, Beijing, Brussels, and Washington are writing the first chapter of the post-globalization world order. And you need to know exactly what that chapter says. The following projections are based on current macroeconomic data, publicly available trade figures, and geopolitical trend analysis. This is not financial advice. All forecasts involve uncertainty. Let me give you the three-scenario strategic framework for what happens between now and July 2026. Scenario 1. The negotiated détente public comments close April 15th, public hearings on May 5th. Several key trading partners, particularly India, South Korea, Japan, accelerate bilateral trade agreement discussions with Washington. They offer expanded market access for U.S. agricultural goods, technology products, and financial services. In return, USTR announces country-specific carve-outs or reduced tariff rates under the final Section 301 determinations. India concludes a partial trade deal with the United States, reducing tariffs on select U.S. goods, expanding pharmaceutical IP cooperation, and committing to increased U.S. defense procurement. India exits the 301 process with minimal damage and maximum leverage secured for the next decade. China, having made no structural concessions, faces a new tariff architecture. Legally robust, Supreme Court proof, potentially pushing effective tariff rates on Chinese goods well above 30%. Scenario 2. The broad tariff wave negotiations stall. Political dynamics in Washington push for a maximalist outcome before the July deadline. The USTR announces Section 301 tariffs on most or all 16 trading partners, tiered by surplus size. China faces the highest rates. The EU, India, and Japan face lower but still significant new levies. Global markets experience short-term macroeconomic shock. But, and this is the critical structural point, the adjustment period accelerates supply chain reshoring decisions that companies have been deferring for years. India's manufacturing FDI inflows accelerate dramatically as multinationals finalize China Plus One strategies under genuine tariff urgency. In this scenario, India absorbs short-term friction but achieves accelerated structural integration into Western supply chains. Scenario 3. Institutional paralysis. Legal challenges to Section 301 tariffs proliferate. WTO dispute mechanisms are activated by multiple trading partners simultaneously. The July deadline passes with partial or delayed implementation. The uncertainty itself becomes the primary market disrupting force, not the tariffs. Companies continue deferring major capital allocation decisions. But here's the structural truth of Scenario 3. Uncertainty about China is now permanent in the minds of Western corporate planners. Even without immediate tariffs, the risk premium on China-dependent supply chains remains elevated indefinitely, and every month of uncertainty is a month where India's stable, growing, strategically aligned alternative becomes more attractive by comparison. In all three scenarios, India's structural trajectory is upward. The velocity differs, the direction does not. One final data point that I want you to hold. In that list of 16 nations targeted by the Section 301 probe, Canada is absent. Canada, the second largest U.S. trading partner, was not mentioned. Now, Canada has faced separate tariff actions from the Trump administration through other mechanisms, but its exclusion from the Section 301 excess capacity probe is strategically revealing. It tells you that Washington's framework here is not purely about trade deficits. It is specifically about manufacturing overcapacity driven by state industrial policy, the kind of government-directed production subsidization that China and, to a lesser degree, several Asian manufacturing economies engage in. Canada doesn't run a state-directed manufacturing overcapacity model. China does. Vietnam increasingly does. And Washington has now decided to confront that model directly. This is the structural realignment, the pivot from rules-based globalization to values and alignment-based trade architecture. In that architecture, where does India sit? India sits at the intersection of democratic governance, market-based economics, and independent strategic alignment. India is not just a trade partner. India is becoming a pillar of the alternative global economic order. Let me close with this. On March 12, 2026, the day we are reporting this analysis, the United States launched the most sweeping unilateral trade investigation since the original U.S.-China trade war. 16 nations, multiple legal mechanisms, a Supreme Court-proof architecture designed to rebuild tariff leverage before a summer deadline. China's response will likely be defiant. Its structural overcapacity model is now too deeply embedded in its national economic strategy to reverse quickly. The European Union will negotiate, but slowly, bureaucratically, with the institutional friction that defines Brussels. India will negotiate with strategic clarity, economic confidence, and geopolitical leverage that no other nation on that list possesses. Because India understands something that Beijing is still struggling to internalize. In the post-globalization world order, relationships matter more than surpluses, alignment matters more than volume, and institutional credibility matters more than manufacturing scale. India is building all three simultaneously. The 301 pivot of 2026 will, in hindsight, be recognized as the moment when the world's trading architecture began its irreversible realignment, away from the China-centric manufacturing model and toward a multipolar, India-anchored alternative. And now, the strategic question I leave with you today: how are you positioning yourself, professionally, financially, and intellectually, for a world where India increasingly dictates the terms of global trade, technology, and economic leadership? Are you watching this shift from the sidelines, or are you building the knowledge, the network, and the strategic framework to move with it and ahead of it? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to know where you stand. I want to know what sectors you're watching. I want to know if you're seeing this shift in your own industry. Because this channel is not a broadcast. It is a conversation among strategic thinkers. And if you want to go even deeper, in our next video, we are breaking down the specific roadmap of India's financial dominance, sector by sector, policy by policy, deal by deal, the manufacturing corridor, the semiconductor push, the rupee internationalization strategy, the trade deal matrix, a complete data-driven blueprint of how India ascends to the top 3 of global economic power, and what that means for markets, for capital flows, and for every nation on Earth. That video drops this week. Make sure you're subscribed. Make sure the bell is on, because the shift is already in motion. And the only question now is whether you're positioned ahead of it or still catching up. Stay strategic.